So we are, Beth and Nancy and I are all here from the Election Modernization Coalition. And if Beth or Nancy, you want to say anything about the work that we've done, I'm newer to it, but I know we've been around for a little while.
Sure. I think we've been around for been working together for close to 10 years now. It takes that long to get election modernization through the legislature, as it turns out. Our big triumph in the 2014 session was to pass the bill that has given us early voting and online voter registration and pre-registering teens. And since then, we've been trying to make all of that better. So.
Yeah, and most recently in 2018, the EMC passed automatic voter registration, which is aimed at bolstering voter participation and reducing barriers to participation in the state, which are also the key challenges that election modernization, which we're talking about on this call, are aimed at addressing. So I think it's important to frame the problem in kind of two ways. The first is just in the US, we have a problem of low voter participation, as I'm sure you all know, despite about 70% of Americans reporting that they think that turnout in presidential elections is very important. We average at 56% turnout. And so that's a problem not just about motivating people to get to the polls, but it's about actual barriers to participation that are in place that mean that eligible voters who make the effort to turn out to vote can't. So a study in 2018 by nonprofit Vote found that 3.6 million eligible voters were unable to cast a ballot because of issues with their registration. In 2014, in Massachusetts alone, 118,000 voters were unable to participate for the same reason. And I think that it is important when we talk about the issue of the registration barrier in the United States to talk a little bit about the history behind it, which the short of it is that voter registration was put in place in the US in the 1800s as a result, and political scientists agree that generally it was both the effect and the intent that voter registration in the US suppressed voting for new immigrants and Black people in the United States who had been in the wake of the Civil War. So Bernard Fraga calls our voter registration process an unusual feature of American elections. And the problem isn't necessarily the fact of registration itself. The problem is the way we do it in the United States, which is that registration is a responsibility of individual citizens rather than of the government. Which is how it's done in most European countries and basically most other countries. So that history matters because its effects on voter participation have been real. And it was not until the 1970s that Maine, Minnesota, and Wisconsin introduced election day registration or same-day registration as a reform that is aimed at, one, making elections easier to administer, but ameliorating the effects of the registration barrier on voter participation in the United States, which, the effect is one that is discriminatory. So today, Election Day registration is in 21 states across the US and in Washington, D.C. It has been now in those three first states for over 40 years. And the short is that it is a simple and effective reform. And we've learned over the past 40 years quite a bit about how Election Day registration works from all of these states.
Notice that little gray patch up there in New England that doesn't have it yet.
A
That would
little,
be us.
the cradle of democracy.
Yeah.
Not quite. Um, so there are a number of things that we know about Election Day registration. The first is that it serves truly as a fail-safe for voters in the event that one, somebody just doesn't register in time, someone moves, or one of the things, there were 2 points the other night, the MIT professor, Charles Stewart, was talking about how election day registration serves as a fail-safe. And what he was talking about was how it is this like final protection for voters in the event of, he was I think jokingly called it thick thumbs, just the event that somebody at some point in the process makes an error or a typo, or in the event of any targeted kind of purges for registration lists. He underscored that despite studying, he's an expert in election security, and April, you were there and heard him talk about this. And what he emphasized was, in specifically the context of like hacking of elections, he was like, look, I worry about the things that I've seen, and what I've seen are people getting purged from the rolls, and I have seen errors in registration keep eligible voters from casting a ballot that gets counted. So that goes to the other thing that election day registration does, is by allowing voters to update or change their registration during early voting or on the day of, it greatly reduces, nearly eliminates the need for provisional ballots, which provisional ballots are there as an alternative for folks who, we can talk about some of this more a little later. The issue with provisional balloting, one, is that it's a lot of work for elections officials after an election. But the second issue, I really believe, is that because provisional ballots are not always counted, it is another piece that communicates to voters who've made the effort to turn out that their vote doesn't matter. And I think that the fact of casting a ballot that doesn't get counted, even if it wouldn't change an election outcome, is still less than fully democratic. So in terms of election security, the one thing that election day registration also offers is it can shift registration away from third-party hosts and instead mean that more voters register in an official polling place by showing identification, rather than, if you just grab a registration card or mail it in or through third-party sites. I don't want to promote the idea of kind of risks to our elections that don't exist, but I think that it is more secure to register through election day registration. And then the other thing we know is that states with election day registration have greater voter participation. So how election day registration works is pretty simple. An eligible voter just needs to show up at their polling place and make a written oath where they attest to their citizenship, to their eligibility, and that they will only cast one vote in the election. And they provide proof of residency, which can be an ID card. It can also be a recent pay stub or a piece of mail. And then they cast a ballot. After elections, eligible voters are added to the rolls, and duplicate registrants are removed. There are some, that is what elections officials also will have, is a list of registered voters, which they don't necessarily use to update those lists in real time. But they're helpful in allowing elections officials to verify if someone comes to the polling place and says, I was registered in Falmouth, but now I live here in Boston. They can see that registration, and it adds another level of verification. So yeah, I think it's useful to reiterate that that knowingly registering when you're not eligible or registering and casting a ballot in multiple places, that is a felony that would result in a $5,000 fine and or up to 5 years in prison. And it's a serious offense that there really is no incentive for any individual to do. And this kind of gets into questions about why anyone opposes election day registration. So I think, like, on that note, I'll start with number 2, which is that election day registration would increase voter fraud. The short answer to that is I completely understand concerns about the security of our elections. However, there is just no evidence from states with election day registration that it leads to any increase in voter fraud, is the first part of the answer. The
It's
second
a really terrible way to steal an election. You know, it doesn't work.
Yeah.
If you're trying to steal election, that's not how you do it.
Yeah, no.
Need some structural changes to be able to do that effectively.
Absentee ballots are how you do that.
Yeah, and I think the other important piece is that, like, you know, it doesn't make sense to try and sway an election one by one, and it just doesn't happen. Like, folks have spent a lot of time and money and energy looking for instances of this kind of voter fraud, and they just haven't found it. There was one study by the Department of Justice under George W. Bush's administration that did a 5-year study, and out of 196 million votes cast, they found 86 instances of voter fraud, which, like, if you type that into a calculator, it shows you one of those weird numbers with like an E and a negative and a 4. Like, it's more than statistically insignificant. But what's even more important than how tiny 86 is spread over 5 years and over 196 million votes is the fact that most of those instances were instances of people just not understanding the law. There were a couple of instances where an election official actually made a mistake. And it's not this, like, the threat of people one by one trying to cast multiple ballots or ineligible voters intentionally trying to cast a ballot is just not a problem that exists. And so then the other points, there are some people, and I don't really think we need to spend a lot of time on the argument that voter registration is good because it serves as a vetting process. I have heard people say that they think that part of the right to cast a ballot should be knowing your registration deadline and taking the time and effort to go register. I disagree with that on its face. But I also, knowing that most people who use election day registration are people who are already registered voters. I've been collecting data from states with EDR, and Vermont, for example, reported that about 3% of their voters who use election day registration use it to newly register. The rest of the people who used election day registration were using it to correct errors in their registration. Other states' numbers look different, more like 15 to 30%, but it's still really small, and it's always less than half, is what I've found so far. So, and then the other piece is some people worry about election day registration costing a lot of money. Because of the drop in the need for provisional ballots, costs just shift from after elections to election day. I don't know, Beth or Nancy, have you heard any other arguments in opposition to election day registration?
The clerks say it's something we've got to figure out how to do, but I think most of them are willing to do it if they're given adequate resources and computer power to confirm that people are registered somewhere else or whatever.
And then I think on first the first point, has anyone on this call done election protection work at the polls on election day before? It is an interesting thing to do that I highly encourage folks to volunteer for on election day. I've done election protection mostly in Dorchester and Mattapan, which are two historically redlined communities of color. And usually the reason, and I've seen lots of people cast provisional ballots who have moved since election day, and they don't know where to vote, and then they wind up casting a provisional ballot. And I think that given the pretty intense crisis of housing and displacement that we know is happening in so much of greater Boston and really across Massachusetts, the argument that voter registration isn't that hard, well, it's not hard if you stay in the same house for 30 years. It is much harder if you are a young person or a working class person who moves a lot. And so we should design for the margins and design a system that works for everyone.
Yeah, thank you. So there are 3 bills that we support. The first, Senator Cindy Cream's bill, can still have sponsors added to it. So what we are kind of going to shift and ask is that we want to get more co-sponsors to that bill. We support all 3. There are some differences that I don't think we need to get too into. One that's probably worth noting, with Nancy's point about some town clerks' concerns, is some town clerks worry about connectivity in polling places because they want to be able to verify by in real time being able to edit our voter registration list, that a voter will only be able to cast a ballot in one place. The thing is that the other states, I think with the exception of Connecticut, that have election day registration don't offer that, and everything that we've already said still stands. So despite not having that real-time ability to edit voter registration lists, voter fraud doesn't happen, period. And there are some issues with if we had that capacity. One, it would limit the number of polling places that could use election day registration. And so in order to do that, basically voters would have to go to a town hall where there is basically a phone line that is secure in order to edit voter registration lists. And it is an extra step that would keep election day registration from working as well as it should. That, I actually don't think is necessary. But overall, I think the short is the legislature is going to do what they're going to do. So we just want election day registration period to get out of committee, which moves into what the next couple months look like. So February 5th is the deadline for bills getting out of committee. I understand that sometimes that deadline is extended. I don't know if Beth or Nancy have found that, if you found that in your experience.
Sometimes I'll push it out for 2 or 3 weeks if the committee hasn't quite finished its work. But it's best to think of it in terms of the bill has to come out by February 5th or it's dead for this legislative session. That's what you're working with here, is whether the bill is going to be killed in committee or not, or get a chance to be voted on the floor.
Yeah. And so what that means for our timeline is in January, we are going to hold, and we don't have the date set, I think it will likely be late January, a lobby day as our public day of action in order to draw the attention of media. And at that point, we already want to have as many co-sponsors to Senator Cream's bill as possible so that the media reports on it favorably, and it is discussed as a piece of legislation with a lot of support. And then any additional representatives at that time who we need to get over the finish line, we can with this concerted day of action. But what that means then for the next month is we need to move members of the House who are, if they're a no, we want them to be a maybe. If they're a maybe, we want them to be a yes. And if they're a yes, we want them to be an active supporter who urges House leadership to get the bills to a vote. So now I forgot whether this slide I was talking about or whether I was going to hand it off to Nancy.
You do this one.
Okay. So yeah, and I guess this is what I'm already talking about, which this next month, we are asking as many Bay Staters as possible to arrange a meeting with their representative, whether at the State House or many are in their districts now, and to, one, encourage friends and neighbors to do the same. We're recording this webinar, and I think we might have another one, but so the goal is that as many people get kind of trained on this issue and can go meet with their representatives as possible. We have, and what everyone will be emailed, the people who participated on Thursday, already have is some talking points, a fact sheet to leave with their representative, and feedback forms to let us know where their rep stands and what issues they have that we can address. And all of us here from the EMC are here to help with arranging meetings, helping you get prepared for the meeting if you have any question, or if you want to join a meeting but don't want to arrange it yourself, we can help with all of that as well. And yeah.
Okay, so this is Lobbying 101. And first, lobbying is not a dirty word. It is how you tell your legislators what you think. So it is a good thing to do. The first thing to do is when you're dealing with a representative is to deal with your representative, your senator and your state representative, the people whose names are on the ballot you cast. They care about constituents. So when you approach them, when you set up a meeting, establish clearly that you are a constituent. Mention where you live. Then the next thing to do is to know the bill name and the number and do a little bit of homework. Look up and see if your senator or your rep are co-sponsors of the bill already. And I think Kristina is sending out the list of co-sponsors, so it's easy to check. If they are, be sure to thank them for that. I want to note that you have the option of you don't have to schlep to Beacon Hill to do this. Now, and particularly now when the legislature is in holiday recess, legislators are in their home districts. Many of them have defined office hours, and you can give their office a call and find out when and where those office hours are. If you can't make that particular meeting, you can go and ask to set up a meeting in the library or the local coffee shop with them for 15 minutes and bring friends to those meetings. More constituents are better. Understand that it's okay to meet with one of their aides. Sometimes it's even better to meet with one of their aides because their legislative aide's job is to keep track of what's happening with bills so that when the bill comes up for a vote, they can then brief the legislator on how many constituents favor this, how many oppose it, where it stands. So meeting with an aide is just as good as meeting with a legislator. Let's see what else. On any printed material, like a fact sheet that you leave behind, you'll put your name and contact information, but in addition, be sure you put that street address so that they know they care about this because a constituent cares about it. An in-person meeting is like the gold standard of lobbying. if you cared enough to show up in person, to schlep to Beacon Hill or to make an arrangement to meet in the district, they know that you're concerned about this and that you are probably telling friends and relatives about this and about what kind of reception you are getting from them. So you're spreading the word about them. Probably goes without saying that you should always treat office staff and aides courteously, because otherwise you will never get another meeting, and because it's a good thing to do. When you have a meeting with a state rep or senator, limit it to one topic, because it makes it much more effective. Don't say, oh, and by the way, while I'm here, I also care about this water bill and this other bill, and it just dilutes your message. And also hold the meeting to 10 to 15 minutes unless they're asking you questions. And as you leave, it's fun to, especially if you meet with an actual legislator, to ask them if you can take a picture with them and share it on your social media. Most of them love to be seen talking to their constituents on social media. They will welcome that. And it also spreads the word about them and about Election Day registration. So next slide, Kristina, next slide, yeah. So when you have your meeting with your lobbyist or with your legislator, ideally, if you can bring 2 or 3 other constituents with you, that's a good thing. But each person in the group, and if it's just one of you, you do this, you introduce yourself, and then you make your pitch. And in a minute, we'll show you what it is for EDR. Answer their questions, and then make the ask. Know what you are asking them to do. So the next slide will show us what those things are for EDR. The first thing, when you introduce yourself, try to tell them in your own words why you care about this bill. If you have an anecdote, a kid's away at college and didn't think to register in time and wasn't able to vote in his very first presidential election, that makes a point. That humanizes the reasons here. Then 1 or 2 facts or data points. There are 4 listed there. Pick 1 or 2 of those. My favorite is that less than half of the people using EDR actually are registering for the first time. There's as much a way of cleaning up the voting rolls and correcting mistakes as it is about registering. But again, people with those mistakes can't vote, and now they can. The specific ask for right now for Election Day registration, what we want is this bill to get out of committee. So if your legislator is already a supporter or a co-sponsor, but even if they're just a supporter, ask them to tell the House Speaker or the Senate President that, I'm hearing a lot of public interest in this Election Day registration issue. So maybe we need to get that bill out for a vote. If your legislature seems uncertain, has questions, is opposed, ask them what's concerning them, what they're, why they don't feel comfortable supporting this bill. Offer to send additional information, and then contact us so we can do that, so we can follow up and bring those people on board. Because there's not a lot of reason to oppose this bill except that people don't know what to do, or they're worried about what the clerks think, or something like that. So specific ask is for people that are already on board, is to contact the leadership in the House or Senate and urge them to get this bill out of the committee and up to the floor for a vote. That's why we're pushing right now. If that doesn't happen, the bill is dead for the session. So this has to happen, and it has to happen by early February. Next one, Christine?
Yeah.
Next. Yeah, these meetings people like this, they're politicians. They like people. They're going to be very friendly, and they like to talk to constituents. Again, if they have any questions at all, let us know via the feedback form, by an email, any way you can let us know so we can follow up with the legislator. Thank them. And again, take a picture with them. If they're meeting with a couple of constituents, it's a great thing to take a picture. You will be sent some information on Election Day registration. You can leave a copy of the fact sheet with them. Again and again, please put your street address on there so they know it came from a constituent, somebody whose opinion they care about. You will also get a lobbying feedback form, and that's what we need to get back so we know who we can count on, who we still need to pester about supporting this. And then you can email that back to Kristina, and that'd be great. Is there anything else? Was that mine, Chris?
Yeah, I think that that covers it. And I want to make sure both, I know April was going to talk a little bit about some of her experience, and Beth, if you want to, if there's anything that you want to add, I want to make sure that we have time for that.
Sure. So these meetings actually are super, super important. The legislature tends to act on legislation. Oh, could we go back one?
Yeah,
That's okay. The legislature tends to act on pieces of legislation that have 70 or 80% support from every single legislator in the state house. So that's usually when there's a sign-on of 80 or 100 legislators, that's really what makes the committee leadership finally move something out of committee and report it positively. And the only way that we're able to get all of those legislators, all 200, or maybe I would say a critical mass of 100 of them, to actually act and get the committee leadership to move something out of the committee and then get the legislative leadership to prioritize it, is by all of us asking our individual representatives to make election day registration a priority. We saw a wave election in 2018. And a wave election still only means that 60% of people voted. We all know that probably 80% of people wanted to vote, but there are many people who have barriers to voting, including an inaccurate or not up-to-date voter registration. So that's why telling our stories about why Election Day registration matters and asking them to make Election Day registration a priority is so critically important. It's because they truly do need to hear from us to prioritize EDR. There are thousands of bills filed this year, and so it is really hard to make it into that top tier of bills that the legislature is going to prioritize, and the only way that they're going to actually prioritize it is if we tell them to.
April, do you want to jump in and tell us a little bit about your experience coming in as an advocate, but also you wrote something that was really great for Common Cause about the first time that you went to a lobby day, and I think that would be really helpful for people to hear about.
Right, I'm happy to do that. So Kristina asked me to tell about my experience at my very first lobby day, which was about a year ago, for automatic voter registration, sponsored by the Election Modernization Coalition. At that time, I was a newly minted activist. So, like a lot of us, a lot of people in Indivisible, we became activists shortly after the 2016 election. So the whole experience was very new to me. Now, I'm relaying my experience as someone new to lobbying. I'll tell you that story. I recognize that a lot of the folks on this call are very experienced at lobbying. You've given a really wonderful overview of that, of what it is and how to make it be successful. You've done a great job there. So I think my 3 comments are going to be maybe talking points for you to inspire others to get involved. So there I am, my first ever lobby day, actually first time ever inside the State House. And I have to tell you, it was a fabulous experience. I totally recommend it, particularly for those new activists, on 3 points: the learning experience, the connections that you make there, and the inspiration. So first off, I was very lucky that my first lobby experience was with Common Cause organized by Christine, because it was really well organized. The talking points on AVR were very clear and very thorough. We had a little mini training. So we did a practice session, and then I was paired with someone who was experienced with lobby days to go off and do the meeting. So I felt very comfortable, even though I was uncomfortable. It was a great learning experience. Then secondly, I met terrific people there. There was a lineup of the speakers from the Election Modernization Coalition, a number of different organizations that were great to learn about and really inspiring. And I also met fellow lobbyists that I'm still in contact with. So that building of the network at a lobby day is really valuable. And then lastly, the whole experience really drove home to me as a new activist the value of those face-to-face connections. The connections, like as you were saying, Nancy, how important that is to go and speak face-to-face. That's how you get your voice heard. So it was a aha moment to me that this is how democracy works. People step up and you can go talk to your electeds, and they actually they want to hear from you. So from that experience now, in our chapter, Indivisible chapter, our members now have participated in a number of different lobby days on many issues. Not all of them are as well organized as the one that I was part of, but they're all really valuable. And we reach out, we know now that we reach out on a regular basis to meet with our elected officials locally as a united voice. So that lobby day experience was that kind of inspiration, like, aha, this is how you step up. So those were the three takeaways that I'd love to see communicated to new activists, the value of participating in a lobby day like this one. The learning experience itself, the connections that you make, and how you feel part of a community and become more well-informed as a result. And then thirdly, learning the way to make an impact and how you as a person, as a citizen, steps up to do that. So we're now looking forward to working with Kristina to set up some of the sit-down meetings with our electeds, our state representatives and our senators. We are lucky in our area to have Barry Feingold as one of our senators, and also Bruce Tarr. But Barry is a key chairmanship related to this. So thank you so much, Kristina, for making what I just described possible, and making it possible for us to really feel like we can take advantage of, based on your leadership, to make a difference on these bills.
Oh, thank you. And it's so exciting to hear you talk about that experience, like, especially because I also relate. And I see these, like, both the content or the thing that would be achieved by election day registration is related to what's achieved by participating in something like a lobby day or just arranging a meeting with your representative. Right. One of the things, like, it's learning that, one, you can make your voice heard and it can count. And two, I think there's so much value to becoming involved, even just meeting once with your representative, with policy on the state level that can help cure the civic apathy that election day registration is also about. I mean, I've at least found a lot of friends of mine who sort of say, you know what, I can't pay attention to politics because it's too depressing. I say, like, well, look at state level stuff, because that's a place where you can have an impact, and it affects your lives and it's part of your community. And obviously there are a lot of competing priorities all of the time, but these things, election day registration and meeting with your representative go hand in hand. And I think it's really important that we get this over the finish line this year with another presidential election coming up.
So Kristina, that's a really excellent point, and it reminds me that you're emphasizing the point that your speaker on Wednesday night made. Remind me his name?
Charles Stewart.
Charles Stewart, right. He was amazing, excellent. And we asked the question, what can decision? How can, and his answer was get people, particularly young people, to volunteer as a poll watcher or security watcher at the polls to have that real life experience. And that makes it real, it makes it meaningful. So just exactly what you're saying, Kristina, meeting with your electeds, having that experience when you go to the polls that you can sign right up and you're welcome, or make changes, you're welcome, and just experiencing it in a personal way.
And I would just say that a great thing to do when you have these meetings is bring along a couple high school kids you might know.
Yeah.
Get them doing this early.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's exactly right.
Yeah, I totally agree. I'd love to figure out a program to make that happen.
Yeah. Yeah.
See if there's a good government club at your high school.
Yeah, there is actually.
And ask them to meet with their legislator.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And it echoes what Beth was saying earlier about part of the value of election protection showing up at the polls is you see the actual issues that keep people from casting a ballot, or that get in the way, even if they, that affect the experience and all of that. So the last couple of things, I will send out an email with just a couple more forms. One, to indicate again, I know folks before this call to sign up indicated what they're interested in doing. My hope is that after the call, people will be up to actually meeting with their representative. And so I'll follow up with you after filling out that form accordingly. You can also just, if you want to hop on the phone, I'm always happy to do that, and you should have my email. But we'll also send you talking points, election day registration fact sheets to leave with your representative, and the feedback form to let us know how the meeting went. If there are other ways that you would rather help, it's always valuable to write, for example, a very short letter to the editor. That's, it's helpful both because people will read them and because we track mentions in the media of election day registration. So we'll see those and we can tweet about them and do our own media using those. You can always also write a letter to your representative, and with all of these things, they're scalable. So you can have a letter to the editor, writing party, or write letters to your representative with your neighbor. You can bring people to meetings and tell your friends and neighbors about this webinar, which we have a recorded version of, which I feel like I probably should have made a note of that for everyone at the beginning. But so we can share it around and use this as a resource for anyone and everyone to help get election day registration over the finish line. That is all I have. If anyone has anything to add or any questions, we've got some time.
I just want to say you did a really great job. Your slides were excellent. Your points are excellent. Really well presented. I'm glad you recorded it, and I'm hopeful it'll be broadly shared.
Yeah.
And let me just repeat the point one more time, how important it is to tell your legislators what you think. Because the anecdote I usually use is I was talking to a senator from the town of Lexington, pretty liberal community. He said, if I had only gone by the emails I got, I would have thought Lexington was against any form of gun control. Now, he was pretty sure Lexington was a strong supporter of gun control, but who he heard from was the other side. And if you don't tell them, no one else will, and they'll only hear from the other side. So it is critically important when you feel strongly about a bill or even care about it at all, to just let them know that they're hearing from the other side.
Yeah, and I think that added to that, Beth made the point that getting anything to a vote and passed really requires a concerted effort from constituents, because any piece of legislation is competing with 1,000 others. And so that's really why individuals help with this. Both matters and is critical, is absolutely necessary. So I think, unless there are any other questions, we can wrap up.
Good Thanksgiving, everyone.
Thank you.